Jim. And thank you, Terry. Where are you?
Right here.
Yeah. You said it all. You really did. I love your words too. They say, you know, a picture is worth 1,000 words, but music is also worth a couple of thousand words maybe. And I'm sure that those hunter-gatherers, before they really learned language, were doing music. I've known a lot of babies, not my own, but other people's babies, who could definitely sing before they could talk. So it's just interesting. And thank you. So this talk is on human nature. Probably the most remarkable aspect of human nature is that we are so adaptable. There's no other species in the world that has adapted successfully to so many different kinds of situations than the human race has. Human behavior, not human nature, but human behavior depends heavily on the circumstances a person is born into. And there are hugely different circumstances in the various societies that human beings have lived in over the last 10,000 years. The anthropologist Ruth Benedict describes and contrasts cultural differences in behavior in her book, Patterns of Culture. But for the 2 million years before that, 10,000, all human beings lived as nomadic hunter-gatherers. It was as hunter-gatherers that we spent 99% of our evolutionary history. And our nature developed as it did, precisely because it was appropriate to that way of life. We had to be adaptable because the climate was changing. We went through several ice ages during the Pleistocene when we started off. And some of us left Africa where it was warm. That's where we really got our start, was in Africa. But by the time it was 10,000 years ago, a lot of us had settled in Europe and Asia where it was colder. So we had to make more adaptations. That's probably why we figured out how to dress and how to make sweaters and so forth. All that migration was done by nomadic people, following the herds of prey animals and foraging for roots and berries as they went. Everyone in this room, and probably everybody that we know, was born into a capitalist society. So if we look around us and observe how our fellow humans act, that isn't a true picture of human nature. That's only a true picture of how human beings born and raised in capitalism act. Capitalism has been called a dog-eat-dog jungle because it tends to foster selfishness and greed. And those qualities don't exist in many, maybe even most human societies, but generally not as pervasively as they do in capitalism. So to explore human nature, we need to sort out what behaviors we see that are really part of our nature as human beings from those that result from our adaptation to the capitalist circumstances that we find ourselves in. A good way to do that is to consider what things human children do spontaneously without being taught. For instance, to walk like a biped, to understand and use language. I want to pause at that point, because that's a good place to make the distinction between human nature and human behavior. It is definitely part of human nature to use and understand language. There's lots of different parts of our brains where that is demonstrated. But it's not hardwired into our brains that we speak English. I've heard people say that if English is spoken clearly and loud enough, everybody ought to be able to understand it. But that is not true. You know, what language or languages we wind up being able to speak depends on our parents and where we were born. So that's just a way to distinguish between the two kinds of things. So I said, we walk like a biped, we understand and use language, and another characteristic is we sleep all night and are active in the daytime. And Terry said, we're afraid of the dark. That's because we are hardwired to cower together at night and sleep, and to be active in the daytime. Some of those things All of those things are hardwired into our brains, and some, like speech and like the way we walk, are unique to us. We don't even share those with our very closest relatives, the primates. Our upright posture is different from any of the apes. Even when they leave the trees and walk, they have much longer arms than we do, so they tend to walk bend over forward with their knuckles dragging on the ground. And we walk upright. Those primate spines, when they're really forward, you can picture a gorilla, because that's the one that you see in pictures the most, with that knuckle walk. Their spines are not curved the same way ours are. I don't mean curved sideways, but which would be scoliosis, but curved front and back. And our pelvises are at a different angle. The pelvic bones are different in their shape to what the pelvis of other primates are like. And this is actually important for thinking about human nature, because the odd shape of our spine and pelvic bones makes giving birth much more difficult for us than it is for just about any other animal. We are the only animal that needs help from others during labor and delivery. And methods of childbirth vary so widely among various cultures that the term natural childbirth can't really be applied to any of them. Childbirth is one of the first areas in any society that rituals build up around it, because the outcome is so important and it's so tricky to do. So you need rituals to get help from upstairs. It's very common for people to make assumptions about human nature. Move this a little bit over this way. Is that still okay? Yeah. It's very common for people to make assumptions about human nature that are not evidence-based. I wanted to speak on human nature today, partly because when I'm talking to people about socialism or about an egalitarian society, which I very frequently am doing, so often people say, it's a good idea, but it would never work because it's against human nature. It's important to look at that assumption carefully, which is what I'm going to do in the rest of this talk. We humans, unlike other animals, are not prisoners of our genes. I put quotation marks around it because that is also the name of the book. We are not prisoners of our genes. We are so adaptable, so flexible, that we can act against our innate human nature, and we do it all the time. Remember that, because we're going to come back to that again later. Another way to sort out what behaviors we see that are really part of our nature as human beings, as opposed to those that result from our adaptations to capitalistic circumstances, is to look at the nature of chimpanzees and bonobos. Both of those apes are so close to us genetically that some scientists have argued that they ought to be classified as part of genus Homo, like we are. Chimps and bonobos each have more than 98.6% of their DNA in common with us, which means that we three species are much more closely related to one another than any of us are to the other apes, like the gorillas or the orangutans. Looking at their primate nature, bonobo nature, and chimpanzee nature, can give us clues about our own nature. Chimps and bonobos both still have habitats in the Democratic Republic of Congo in Central Africa. Central and a teeny bit west, east, I guess, but it's pretty much in the middle. Chimps live north of the Congo River, and bonobos live south of it. That means that chimps have to compete with other animals, especially gorillas, who are much larger than chimps, for scarce food resources, whereas bonobos have the southern region pretty much to themselves. Those differences in their habitat and the circumstances that they and their ancestors were born into may explain why those two species, who are so close to us, evolved to have very different lifestyles, their behaviors entirely unlike one another's. Chimpanzees are extremely violent. They live in groups. All primates live in groups of different sizes. It is very rare for chimps to kill members of their own group. But when groups of chimps meet, the males sometimes wage all-out wars and then slaughter the infants and take the females as their own. dominant chimpanzee mothers do away with the children of other chimps. That's probably why a lot of people think that it's human nature to be warlike, because chimps do it. And if chimps do it, then if other primates do it, then so should we, or so must we. Chimpanzee females, like most mammals, go into heat regularly. You know, that's when you go into heat, that means you're fertile, if you're an animal. Male chimpanzees guard, quote, their, end quote, females from other males when the females are in heat, to prevent them from being fertilized by a rival chimp. Within the group, they cooperate and they share food. Primatologist Frans de Waal has demonstrated that when you throw food into a chimpanzee enclosure, at first there's a scramble for it, and then the dominant males arrive on the scene, and everybody follows them into a hut within their enclosure and divides up the food. The most dominant ones get the biggest share, but everybody gets some, even the chimp that's lowest on the hierarchy gets something to eat. So that's chimpanzee behavior. Yeah, they're violent, they're warlike, but at least none of them starve if there is food. That's a little different from humans too. Yeah. De Waal, based on that note about chimpanzee behavior, and he's also written a book about bonobos, but I haven't read that. But he has written, quote, "Evolution has etched some really basic instincts into our brains: sharing, reciprocity, and the most basic one of all, empathy. These seem to be something that all primates have, including us." Bonobos, unlike chimps, are very laid back. They have what might be called a matriarchal society. Female bonobos have high status, with the dominant female and the dominant male being co-equal but with different responsibilities. Females forge the alliances, and a male bonobo's rank in the hierarchy depends on his mother's. When groups of bonobos meet, the males hoot and stand back, while the females cross over to one another in what may end up resembling an orgy. The primatologist Frans de Waal has also remarked that our human sexual urges are subject to such powerful moral constraints that it's hard to recognize how they permeate all aspects of our social life, and that bonobo society could teach us a lot about human sexuality might look like without those constraints. No one has ever seen a bonobo kill another of its own kind. Bonobo children are cared for by all the females in the group. They do have conflicts, often behaving just like humans by screaming at each other and showing off their strength, but they tend to find ways actually not to harm each other, either individuals of the same group or from a different one. Female bonobos have hidden ovulation, just like we do, us human females. It means they don't come into heat, like chimps and most other mammals do. No one can tell when a bonobo is fertile. Bonobos use sex, not just for making babies, but also as a bonding mechanism and to reduce social tension. And there's a lot of sex in the bonobo community with bonobo females who are not in heat, and the bonobos males don't know one way or another. But because of hidden ovulation, the male bonobos have no reason to guard females, because they don't know when the females are in heat. So the females have more time to themselves than the female chimps do. And they have more time to form female-to-female bonds than chimps do. In one experiment, this was not done by de Waal, it was done by other people, whose names I can't remember right now, and couldn't think of in time to put them into the talk, but it was a different group of people. It was two different writers, and I think they were Korean. But in one experiment, 14 bonobos, one at a time, were placed in a cage with food, flanked by 2 cages with no food, one of which contained a familiar group member, and the other a complete stranger bonobo that they'd never seen before. The bonobos with food had the option of eating it all themselves, or to share it by opening up the door of the cage on either side of them and inviting them in. 9 of the 14 individuals that took part chose to share with the strangers first. They all chose to share, but it was even with the stranger before the one that they knew. Bonobos are willing to sacrifice part of their meal, even when they themselves will not receive any benefits and might even have to pay a cost. Both bonobos and chimpanzees are hierarchical, but males and females are co-equal among bonobos, where among chimps, females are submissive to males. At the top of the bonobo hierarchy is the dominant female, not a male. Now I want to describe a little bit about us Homo sapiens, our direct ancestors, starting with Homo erectus, who lived at the very beginning of the Pleistocene period. We were nomadic hunter-gatherers during the vast majority of our evolutionary history. Around the remains of the first Homo erectus that they discovered, there were tools made out of bone and stone that were shaped in such a way to suggest that they were used for digging, and what would they be digging for other than roots to eat, and others that had pointy ends, which presumably are for hunting. So way back in Homo erectus days, at the very beginning of the Pleistocene period, they were hunting and gathering. So that's a pretty basic thing. By about a million years ago, Homo erectus had spread pretty widely within Africa and started to evolve into Homo sapiens, which has now spread all over the whole world. Beginning sometime between 12,000 and 10,000 years ago, because it didn't happen all at once and it happened differently in different places. But around 12 or 10,000 years ago, human beings, Homo sapiens, began domesticating animals and plants, becoming farmers and herders. And they call that in some books the agricultural revolution, capital A and capital R. The agricultural revolution, which marks the beginning of class society. Homo sapiens, when they were living as hunter-gatherers, did not have a class-divided society. It was basically an egalitarian way of living. Human culture, human civilizations changed that rapidly after food surfaces began to be developed with farming and the domestication of animals. And the gulf between the ruling class and all the other classes, gradually but constantly, has been widening ever since. But by 1500, at the dawn of the European expansion, hunter-gatherers still occupied almost a third of the world's landmass, including all of Australia, the northwestern half of North America, the southern part of South America, including parts of sub-Saharan Africa and parts of Asia. Even today, there are some hunter-gatherer groups left on Earth, although their habitat is shrinking as civilization takes over. So for almost 2 million years, 2 million minus 12 or 10,000, all human beings sustained themselves by foraging, hunting, and fishing. They had few possessions, since whatever they owned needed to be carried along with them when they moved camp, as Carrie had said too in one of the songs. Hunter-gatherers lived in egalitarian bands in which everyone, male and female, young and old, were treated as equals, as they were equal, because they all had the same access to their means of sustenance, which was berries and roots and fish and game. That wasn't owned by anybody. It was just there, and they could take what they needed from it. They were generally very healthy, much healthier than we are. They were not afflicted with the chronic diseases of modern civilization, such as diabetes, obesity, dental decay, coronary heart disease, and high blood pressure. And all of that is really documented from analyzing their DNA and the bones and so forth that we have from them. They lived fulfilling lives and had far more leisure time than we do, needing only to work an average of 3 or 4 hours a day. Most groups lived in peace. The hunter-gatherer societies that still exist are still egalitarian because everyone has a relatively equal share of the available resources. But the habitat available for nomads today is shrinking as capitalism takes over the planet. So nomadic peoples are restricted to the less desirable places. Their life is probably not as wholesome and healthy as it originally was. And ultimately, they will almost certainly be assimilated by civilized capitalist states. But hunter-gatherers lived for 1,990,000 years in a sustainable lifestyle, something we can only dream of doing today as more and more of the Earth's resources become diminished and poisoned. They lived in accordance with human nature. Do we? Let's review the elements of human nature that we've identified so far. First, we noticed adaptability, the most obvious one. Then we added the use and understanding of language, walking like bipeds, being daytime creatures as opposed to nocturnal, and being gregarious. Then we noted some primate traits that we've inherited, including not only being aggressive and hierarchical, but also sharing and being empathic, which leads to a reluctance to kill our fellow humans, and altruism. Now that's fascinating because I so often hear that altruism is against human nature, but it isn't. If those bonobos were altruistic, we can be altruistic. We have 98.6% of DNA shared with bonobos. So if they can do it, we can do it. Some studies have also shown that young human children show altruistic behavior too, but it tends to be beaten out of them or gotten out of them somehow pretty young, because adults talk a lot about that's mine, not yours, and so forth, and it's just altruism goes out the window, usually by the time kids get to school. And I don't mean preschool and daycare stuff, I mean 5 years old or so. And we can also add generosity to the list of qualities that are hardwired in our brains, thanks to an article that I just read very recently in the current issue of The Atlantic. The title of the article is The Neurology of Generosity. And it documents that generosity is indeed hardwired into our brains, but also noting that 85% of Americans donate less than 2% of their income to charity. Well, that's not really too hard to figure out the reason for it. That's because so many of us are aware that we're only a paycheck or two away from poverty if we don't earn enough to support ourselves. Hunter-gatherers lived with an abundance of resources at their disposal. Now most of us see very little of abundance. It's mostly owned by the 1%. There's really nothing in the hunter-gatherer lifestyle that goes against human nature, which makes sense because that is how we evolved. But there are lots of things that discourage the expression of human nature in present society. The problem is, as previously noted, we are so adaptable that we can choose to ignore our own deep nature. But when we do ignore it, that causes us stress. When I listed all the diseases that hunter-gatherers apparently didn't have, you may have noticed that many of those were diseases that we know to be stress-related. It is stressful for people with our human nature to live in this dog-eat-dog jungle of capitalism. It isn't healthy for us. It is our nature to be nocturnal. But in that job I had at Emerson, I found out that being nocturnal is not healthy. And one of the nurses that shared that shift with me was told by her doctor that she needed to get a different job because her blood pressure was really out of control working nights. And she was able to switch to the 3 to 11 shift at that hospital. So it worked out for her. I suspect the reason that most nurses will stick out the 11 to 7 shift, which they do, is because they need the money because we're living in capitalism. So we can make a choice to go against human nature, but when we do, we pay a price, and the price is stress. Hierarchies are part of human nature, but natural human hierarchies need not lead to domination which leads to violence and warfare on the personal and on the state level. In all those years of hunter-gatherer societies, hierarchy never led to domination. Does it in 21st century America? You bet your life it does. We all know that, definitely. Aggression is part of human nature too, but how aggression is played out is based more on culture than on nature. Nomadic hunter-gatherers are egalitarian societies which are not completely without aggression, not completely without limited violence, but they don't engage in wide-scale or extreme violence or in warfare. Instead, they have many methods of conflict management and reconciliation techniques which keep aggression and violence to a minimum. Therefore, it should be noted that there are more examples of peace and cooperation in the bulk of human evolution, during 99% of which humans lived as nomadic hunter-gatherers, than there are of violence and war. Human nature does not require us to be warlike, but capitalism does. Anyone who's gone through basic training in the military knows that reluctance to kill a fellow human being is overruled and overpowered by that experience. Soldiers are expected and required to kill their fellow human beings on command. We've all heard from our friends at Veterans for Peace how stressful that is. And being forced to go against everything our visceral primate brain is shouting at us, our human nature, probably is the root cause of PTSD. Nomadic hunter-gatherer societies are not primitive in that they do successfully meet the needs of all members of that society. Does capitalism? Capitalism kind of sort of meets the needs of the richest 1%. It doesn't even really do that because capitalism as a system is causing a lot of environmental degradation, which is bad for the 1%, just like it's bad for the 99%. But it kind of sort of meets the needs of the 1%. The 99% includes people who are starving, not because there isn't enough food to go around, but because they lack money to buy the food. It also includes masses of homeless people, and masses of prisoners, and people living on or below the poverty line, and people suffering from diseases, both mental and physical, that are caused by stress. Black people in capitalist America are under so much stress that they have the highest rate of premature births of any ethnic group in the world. The stress hormone cortisol bathes their unborn babies in the womb, causing this prematurity. And I'm talking about not just a little premature, but like, months premature, where the baby needs to be in the intensive care unit for a significant amount of time before it can be given to its parents. There's been a very big study going that is finished about why there is so much prematurity in that group. Because it's been known for a long time that it was there, but nobody really knew the reason. So they did all kinds of careful evidence-based research, eliminating one variable after another variable. And it came down to the stress level of cortisol doing it for Black women who live in the United States. It's not because there's something different about them genetically, and it's not related to their income level or anything else. All of these things were ruled out, their education level. They didn't bring, but they took as part of the study about, I think it was about 10, because this is not a large group, of Black women from the same part of Africa that the slaves came from. So genetically that should be the same. Those women did not ever, none of them gave birth to a premature baby during the course of the study. But their children did. So, you know, when a black woman is raised in her native country and gives birth anywhere, including here, that baby has the same fighting chance as any other baby. But by the time the daughters of those women had been here for just one generation, they had the same high prematurity rate that black people who've been here forever do. So that's a good finding. So no, capitalist societies do not meet the needs of every member of society. Capitalism operates in the interest of the ruling class, the wealthy elite. It does not, because it cannot, operate in the interests of society as a whole, the entire human community. Given that we live in such a system, the amazing thing is that we do still have the same human nature that we began developing even before we were fully human. When our great-great-grandparent was a primate common ancestor that was about to branch into three strains, the violent chimpanzees, the peaceable bonobos, and the ever-adaptable humans. We ordinary people in the 99% still have empathy. We still have the generous and altruistic urge to help each other with no thought of reward. Witness the efforts to help after Hurricane Katrina and after 9/11. We have not lost the values of the hunter-gatherers. It's just harder to honor values like altruism and generosity in today's world, where money and love of profit rule. And we are kept so busy and so distracted by day-to-day problems that we don't seem to notice that all our attempts to fix capitalism over the last 200 years have had no effect at all. Capitalism cannot be fixed. Even after centuries of capitalism, ordinary people retain the values of sharing, cooperation, empathy, altruism, and generosity. It is not too late for us to change the world. This does not mean we should go back to being hunter-gatherers. It's too late to go back. We have to stay focused on eliminating capitalism and moving on to a world fit for human beings to live in. That world will be without money. Money really gets in the way of being egalitarian. And without classes, no rich and no poor. For a species whose outstanding characteristic is adaptability, capitalism may just be fatally maladaptive. That means we have no time to waste. Thank you.
During Terry's last song, we will pass the plate around. We depend on your generosity to keep this thing going.
Thanks. I do want to say there are books on the table over there. One of them is my book, which is available today and today only at a discounted rate of $10. And the other book is always $10. But the other book is called Yes, Utopia. We Have the Technology. And it's kind of meant for people who think egalitarian socialism is a good idea, but we can't make it work. So the book kind of gives some clues about how it could work. And it's a good book to read. It was written by Ron Cook, who is English. He was in Bristol, England. And he's passed, unfortunately. But we have a good stock of his books on hand, so I brought some of them in today.
Okay.
So, questions?
Are there any
Comments?
questions?
Yeah, Karla, thank you very much for the nice talk. Two questions, one philosophical, one maybe applicable questions. One is for the logo. I like the logo, Human Nature, which we had there. only the color red is missing. Do you have any philosophy about this logo, how you choose this, or what it
You mean the little
That's
picture?
right, yes.
I had nothing to do with choosing that.
Okay,
That was home fries.
that's a quick answer.
Yeah.
The more difficult answer is, what would be your suggestion of a legal system to implement the human nature in the modern society?
A legal system?
Yeah, legal system. Mhm.
Well, that's an interesting question. Historically, laws are there to protect the interest of the ruling class. The earliest law code there is Hammurabi's code from thousands of years ago. It wasn't there to make sure that nobody starved. It was there to make sure that the ruling class wasn't threatened by anybody from underneath them. So I don't picture there being any laws in the kind of society that I want. There will obviously need to be an administration of affairs, and that'll be done probably on many different levels. You need, on the neighborhood level, the community level, probably just done like by the people in that neighborhood, in local assemblies. There are other things that would need to be regionally decided, like management of the Mystic River. You know, I am a friend of the Mystic River because I live in Somerville and it runs through there. But it runs through many different communities. So you need regional management of a lot of things. And probably if there's any controversy, regional management could be done by a committee that was elected. If it's not very controversial, it could be done by people who volunteer to be on a committee with no particular oversight. Because who would want to be on a committee if they weren't, if they didn't want to really fix the problem? And on larger regions, like North America, or the largest region, the globe, they require different kinds of administration. It's impossible to say at this point what exactly would be arranged, because we're not there yet. We don't know what the technology is going to be then. It may be completely different, or we all may be living on houses on stilts because it's underwater. There's all kinds of changes that are going to happen in between now and then. Because a weather revolution could happen in the time it takes a person to change their mind, which is no time at all. It doesn't seem to be happening. So I like to say that we don't have a blueprint for how it's going to play itself out. But we do know that we have to keep our eyes on the prize and know what we're aiming at. What we're aiming at is an egalitarian community, a classless, moneyless society where everybody has common access to the available wealth. If there isn't enough of something to go around, then committees have to decide how that gets spread out. But in fact, if the revolution happened soon, there's plenty to go around. It would not be an issue at all. If we wait long enough and let capitalism continue until Boston's completely underwater, which is going to happen sooner or later, and the rest of the world is limited, maybe there won't be enough to go around. Maybe we'll be in a whole different situation. I don't know what's going to happen then. Let's not wait for it to happen. That's why I think the last sentence of my talk was we have to do it soon. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
I have a question about hierarchy. You said that it's part of human nature. I'd like to understand that because I just look around and there are so many people that are say that they're leaders, but they're very top down, and sometimes they talk about how they're going to do something about transparency, the lack of transparency, and it's not believable because they don't let anybody else talk,
Right.
and they don't. So I'm just curious what you mean by that.
Well, I mean that we are, there is the basis of hierarchy in our genetic makeup, but it gets played out differently in different cultures. In this culture, you got it, that's what it is. It's a hierarchy where the very, very wealthy call the shots, and we don't even get to elect them. The top of the hierarchy is just a very few families. And it's based on money, and it's awful. So, but it doesn't have to be that way. It probably will remain that way as long as we have capitalism, but we have to get rid of capitalism. And that, we hope, I'm sure that's not going to require violence to get rid of capitalism. What we envision is either after there are more and more people who are in agreement that capitalism needs to go, and there's quite a lot, it's more than you think. Once there is enough to win an election, then maybe socialist candidates, real socialist candidates, not people like Barney Frank, who really are not. He doesn't want a classless, moneyless society, okay? But when there is really a majority of people who want a classless, moneyless society, and are willing to work to support it, because if you want everything for free, you also have to be able to work for free. So you eliminate not only the ruling class, but also you eliminate the working class. It's no classes. So everything is done volunteer. It wouldn't take very many people to do that. If you think of all the people who are now employed at something that there would be no need for at all in the kind of society that we're talking about. You don't need accountants, you don't need salesmen, you don't need bankers, you don't need all kinds of people. There's huge numbers of people who would be out of work, basically, because there's nothing for them to do. So those people would be in the workforce to do things that did need to be done. So that's, I guess I didn't do it, so.
Well, when you say hierarchy is part of human nature, what do you mean by that? I mean, do you see, I just don't understand because...
Well, in most human cultures, just like in all primate cultures, there is, depending on the size of the culture, like even the nomadic hunter-gatherers that still exist, they exist within capitalism. They're on the fringes of it, but they don't really have abundance and so forth. They tend to have a chief. That's a hierarchy. A chief is the first step towards a hierarchy. In the hunter-gatherer societies that currently exist, the chief has very little power. He doesn't want to have more possessions than the rest of the members of his band, because that would create jealousy, and they would want to leave his band and go to a different band of hunter-gatherers. And there's no law against it, so anybody in one hunter-gatherer band is perfectly welcome to leave it and go to another band in the same overarching tribe of hunter-gatherers. But we do not usually maintain ourselves for very long without one person that's in charge.
Is it just one person?
In that case, it's just one person. And the people in the tribe or the band are probably not very many. The larger the group of people gets, the more oversight there needs to be. And I think that at the top of the hierarchy in an egalitarian society would be volunteers who want to make sure that enough food is distributed to where it's needed. Where it's needed and distributed to where it's needed. That's an example. But you do have to have some oversight to make sure that things happen the way they're supposed to. And that's usually done not by completely leveled people, but somebody's in charge who has done the research and figured out what exactly should happen in order to get the agreed upon goal done.
And not because they have more money.
No, well, there won't be money. So that's... And people often ask, how are you going to stop that kind of committee from taking over? What would their motivation be? They already can get anything they want. There's really no motivation to want to be powerful. You already have what you want. Steve.
Okay, well, Karla, thank you for the excellent talk. I would like to start by recommending a book by Peter Kropotkin called Mutual Aid, which illustrates some
Yes.
some of what Karla said, and Kropotkin was a scientist in addition to being a very prominent anarchist. But, well, I would like to make just a couple of points, and yeah, I would like you to respond to them. One is that there are hunter-gatherer societies, or have been over time, that had the reputation for being very aggressive and warlike, and some of which practice cannibalism. So I'd like you to comment on that. But also I would like to say that there is a Jewish conception that every human, regardless of the society we're born into, has, among other things, the evil inclination, but that we also have free will and are able to suppress the evil inclination and support the good inclination in ourselves.
Well, I don't see any evidence for that last thing that some people think. There have been hunter-gatherers who were cannibals. The Iroquois nation had cannibals in it. They also had a lot of good things, and they eventually did give up their cannibalism. Cannibalism usually is there because there's not very much meat. And long pork is what it's called, because I guess we taste like pork. Because our diet is similar to a pig's diets are. But when you get more meat, more protein in the diet, cannibalism tends to stop. Now, so say the beginning of it again, because I got distracted by the second part of it.
That there are societies that we know of that have been warlike.
Yes, well, but they're not many. I would invite you to read Patterns of Culture if you haven't already. Have you looked at that book?
So long ago that I can't
Yeah.
remember.
Well, it talks about different societies, and they're all pretty primitive. You know, well, I read it a long time ago too, but I've retained bits of it because I use it for reference, and I have it at home to check on my facts sometimes. There have been some situations where it's warlike. The Iroquois got warlike mainly after the Europeans got here, and that's when they had to fight back against the Europeans. But I don't think that before the Europeans arrived, the Iroquois had wars. I may be wrong about that, but that's my understanding. And I don't know about other cannibal societies. Do you, or does anybody here?
Can I say one quick thing on that
Sure.
point? I've done a lot of reading on Native American societies and others, and there certainly was conflict, and there were what we would consider wars. But in many cases, the goal was not to kill the opponent. You could get, you could make your point by even like touching an opponent in battle, or different ways of establishing dominance that were short of actually killing your opponent. So I think that's we can credit with capitalism with sort of the industrial scale war that we have now.
I'd like to ask a question. Cuba is pretty much a socialist society, and
Cuba?
Well, would you
Well, we talk.
speak to what Cuba has been trying to do?
Well, I'm going to speak to Cuba as a socialist society, because that's the important aspect of that question. I said that a socialist society, an egalitarian socialist society, has no money and no classes. Are you saying that there's no money in Cuba? Are you saying that there are no classes in Cuba? It's not a socialist society. It's a
Do you
capitalist.
feel it made any advances towards the kind of goal that you look for?
I have to admit that I'm not au courant about what's going on in Cuba now. I'm not. But the last time I knew anything about it, they were way better off than people in the United States. You know, Fidel was taking care of people, and I'm not sure what happened next. But what he did not create socialism, and I don't think he ever had that intention. Any more than Chavez in Venezuela did. Yeah.
There are as many different kinds of socialism as there are Protestant denominations.
Okay. a lot of people want to stop using the term socialism.
Yeah, first of all, Hollande in France is supposed to be a socialist,
Yeah.
supposedly.
Obama's supposed to be a socialist, according to some
Well,
people.
I don't care according to those
Yeah,
ignoramuses,
yeah.
but he's not officially a socialist.
Well, then, if you think socialism, if that word doesn't work for you, don't use it. This has been called the cooperative commonwealth. That's the term that William Morris used a lot. It's been called a world of free access. That's been used a lot too, but neither of those is bad. Our organization, the World Socialist Party, which is part of the World Socialist Movement, and the World Socialist Movement is an international organization. The subject has come up several times, whether we should stop using the word socialism. We are completely democratic. It's one person, one vote. It's always gone against changing the word. So I would not be opposed to eliminating the word socialism as long as it was clear what we meant. But in a democratic organization, that didn't pass. So we're not going to give up democracy just for that. However, in our work, we don't always use the word socialism, and it's not necessary to. An egalitarian revolution, which John spoke about when he was here last September, that's the same thing I'm talking about, exactly the same thing.
One or two more questions before we close.
There were more than two hands up, I think.
Well, Karla, it strikes me that nobody, or almost nobody, gravitates towards a country that's a war zone. And that's a place like hyper competitiveness. And if you look at like patterns of migration now, a lot of people try to migrate to Europe, I mean, especially from Africa. And what do we see in, especially Northern Europe, is, I know you're not going to call it that, but other people in the room would call it that, a socialist economies where there's a safety net, where there's a less income inequality than here in the U.S. And I think that's kind of a testament to the attractiveness of having a society that has, that provides for people, as opposed to, like, nobody's going to immigrate to the DRC right now or an area like that.
I'm going to ask somebody else to speak to that, but I also want to say, I hope you come to, I forget which date it is, maybe Dean or somebody else can look it up, but what day is Stephen Schoenfeld coming?
Next Sunday.
That's next Sunday, okay. Yeah, so Ron is in 2 weeks.
I was in 2 weeks.
Okay.
Kathy Kelly,
Okay.
Tom Hayden.
Stephen's topic, Virginia, is globalization and nationalism. And I think that he will probably speak somewhat to what your question is. But I'm going to ask, is there anybody here who thinks they can answer that better than me? Because I don't think I can. Repeat your question.
Well, it's just an observation, it's an opinion, that if you think about a society that's hyper-competitive, it would be like a war zone. And a war zone is not an area that people are attracted to. Most people are not attracted to go live in a war zone. And right now, an area that is attractive to a lot of people fleeing war zones are Northern Europe. And what's in Northern Europe? What are called socialist economies with safety nets, like a strong safety net in their society.
I don't think Karla wants to call Northern Europe socialist.
No, they're not socialists. There's no example that I can point to of a socialist or an egalitarian state or country. So it,
Wouldn't you still be able to argue, though, that countries that have the likes of healthcare and education for their people are more highly evolved than us?
well, I don't think they're more highly evolved. I think they're luckier than us.
Yeah.
Ron?
On that one point of being closer to socialism, most of these socialist changes that they made were the result of deliberations on how to cheapen the working class, the costs of raising workers, and make them less expensive to maintain. So they're not really aimed at improving the well-being of people. They're just hoping that the well-being of people will lead to more efficient organization of the working class. But if you look around, there's hardly any place where there isn't poverty in Europe. So I mean, it hasn't really. If you just have poverty, you're going to have. You're not going to have gotten away from capitalism at all. So you have to get the basic condition before you can say that you've eliminated capitalism, where you've got socialism in effect.
I thought the Scandinavian countries, the reason that they're, and they do have wonderful things compared to what we have as far as education and healthcare. I thought it was based on their making a lot of money on fossil fuels. And if we don't leave 80% of the fossil fuels in the ground that we have, then, I mean, we're going to have huge climate change disasters. So I don't know, that's what I had heard. I don't know if that's anybody else knows more.
If that's right, that's good. I mean, it's not, I'm saying it's good, but it's an answer to the question.
Yeah, I would say that countries like Cuba and Sweden and Denmark and so forth are not socialist because they still have the wage system. Every worker in those countries is a wage slave who is required to go into work every day, punch a card, and does not receive back the full product of their labor. And they do not have free access to the stuff that they produce. Some capitalist countries are much more benign, much more supportive of their citizens than what the United States has turned into, the direction the United States is going into. But this is a far cry from socialism.
One more question.
I would just like to make one little point here about when people would say socialism, or a wageless, moneyless society would never work. When they say that human nature is against arranging that, what they forget is that capitalism itself is against human nature and actively suppresses it wherever it can. You just gave a lot of examples of that, in fact, in your talk. When you go to war, when a country goes to war, people have to put their personal lives aside, and they have to follow the orders that they're given, which involve killing other people. So I mean, that in itself is suppressive. That's against human nature right there, and that the belief that aggression is a fact that just evolves into war ignores the fact that you need a high degree of organization, and in modern wars you need money. Wars cannot be fought without money or the mobilization of economic resources. And that goes way back. It's not just capitalism. So, I mean, is war something or I should say aggression, something that precludes the possibility of
egalitarian society, or? I don't think so.
No. It doesn't. We don't, the impulse to war doesn't come from ordinary people. It comes from the people who have the money. Ordinary people don't have the money to start war even if they wanted to, but they don't. And you know, every time a war is announced, there's an outcry against it from ordinary people, which is ignored by the people who have the money.
Seeing no more hands, thank you very much, Karla. That was